Well, welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce Yves Citton, our speaker tonight. Yves is currently a professor of literature at the Université de Grenoble and visiting professor at this semester at NYU and at Harvard University. I think Yves, you figured out the gift of ubiquity, and so
train.
It's called the train. Yes. Yeah. Yves is the author. Yves Citton is the author of a number of books and a great many articles. I mentioned just a few titles. The first book, which came out in 1990 Impuissance on political power and sexual impotence, sexual failure, défaillance, which is a great French word, défaillance, which is a fantastic book on literature, power, and sexuality. Yves has published on 18th century economic theory. He's published a great book on Spinoza in the 18th century Imaginaire, called L'Envers de la Liberté, on Spinoza and the French Enlightenment, which came out in 2006. And more recently, I want to mention two books which have come out in the last few years. One is Lire, Interpréter, Actualiser, Pourquoi les études littéraires, published at Édition Amsterdam, which is, I strongly recommend it to all of you. It's a fantastic book on the practice of literary reading and the practice of literary interpretation today, the importance of the practice of literary interpretation today. And it begins with a response to some remarks by a French politician about literature, about Princesse de Clèves more specifically. It's a wonderful book. And your latest book, I believe, L'avenir des humanités, which came out at La Découverte, which is also a spirited defense of literary studies, cultural studies, the humanities in general. And I believe it was reviewed in both L'Humanité and Télérama, which is a feat, which is, and positively reviewed in both these publications. And I want to add that Yves Citton is also a jazz critic, jazz enthusiast, jazz encyclopedia, and that he is also one of the editors of the journal Multitude. The images were up just a minute ago, which, to my mind, is one of the most engaging, one of the most interesting and cultural political journals coming out of Europe today, and which is published so in hard copy, but 4 times a year in hard copy, but also ends up online a month or 2.
A year after the publication.
So I encourage you to read it, so to subscribe, of course, but also as you're waiting for your issue to read Multitude online. And tonight's talk, and there's one more book coming out, right? Antiphène de la Roche, which I believe is the first, so I won't say anything more, which is the first part of tonight's talk on the image as agency. And I believe there's also a handout, which I hope I made enough copies of. So welcome, Yves. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Phil, for inviting me, the Maison Française, for setting it up. I'm very happy to be here. Even more because what I'm going to present now, it's a joint project that we're trying to develop with Phil. So if there's any good idea, it comes from him. If there's any mistake, I'll be totally responsible for that. He knows more about cinema and images than I do, but I'm interested in this guy called Gilbert Simondon. And I just want to know, who's heard of Gilbert Simondon? Apart from Quentin Badel. Yeah, well, a few people, but maybe, hopefully not as many as of Gilles Deleuze, because originally I thought, I'm going to do something on Deleuze and cinema, and I realized everybody's doing something on Deleuze and cinema. There was something very good that some of you were here maybe for a couple of weeks ago with Patrice Manillier and Elie Durin. So I changed my talk, and I'm going to focus on Simondon, who has a link with Deleuze, which is that when you see Gilles Deleuze talk about individuation, very often this person, Gilbert Simondon, is not far behind. So, but I won't mention Deleuze today. I will organize my presentation for about 45, 50 minutes in a number of parts, basically 3 parts. One sort of introduction in 3 parts with this author called Tiphaine de la Roche, Charles Tiphaine, an author from the 18th century, even more unknown than Gilbert Simondon, whose only claim to fame is to have invented photography half a century before photography was invented. So you'll see that he didn't really invent it, but he did something interesting with it. Then a few quotes from André Bazin, his famous article on the ontology of photographic image. If you study with Phil, probably you've read a little bit of it, so I will give you a few very fast quotes. Move to Roland Barthes, also just 2-3 quotes from Roland Barthes on photography, so that'll be the first part. Then the core of my presentation will be just quotes, so hopefully everybody has a handout with the whole second page is full of quotes that I translated from one book by Gilbert Simondon, and that's what I'm really interested in presenting today. And at the horizon, I'm telling you now to sort of raise the stakes, what I'm interested in thinking about photography, history of the representation of photography and Gilbert Simondon, is to revisit, maybe from a slightly different perspective, the analog image versus digital image, of which I'm not at all a specialist, but I think maybe these readings can shed a certain light on it. So, first part, brief history of the ontology of the photographic image, and I'll explain that word factishism very soon. My first stop is 1760. So in 1760, an unknown physician from the north of France, from Normandy, from Montebourg, Normandy, publishes a book called Giffanti. And Giffanti, as you can see, it's an anagram of Tiphaine. So the book is not signed, but we can guess it comes from this person, Charles Tiphaine de la Roche, born in 1722, dead in 1774. And in this book called Giffanti, so people say starting from 1850, and so does Wikipedia say, I found that just a week ago, he supposedly invented photography. So I'm going to give you the excerpt where he's supposed to have invented photography. I just to situate them, saying that this novel of Giffanti is the narration of a traveler who is carried up in the air and lands in an island in the middle of the desert. So he's in Africa. It's a desert, and he thinks he's in the desert. He's carried up, he wakes up in this place called Giffanti, which is inhabited by elementary spirits. So they are invisible beings floating in the air who happen to be among us. So you should imagine our room here filled with elementary spirits, and the island of Giffanti is where they go to rest. It's like a vacation resort for esprit élémentaire, the elementary spirit, but they're all among us. And in this travel in Giffanti, the narrator discovers all kinds of technological devices. While he's walking in this place, which is a desert, he all of a sudden sees something like that. And he asks his guide, I thought we were in the desert, how come I can see the sea? How come I can see a storm at sea? And the answer, by the préfet de Giffanti, the administrator of Giffanti, goes thus, and these are the quotes you have. The elementary spirits, continued the prefect, are not so able painters as naturalists. You shall judge by their way of working. You know that the rays of light reflected from different bodies make a picture and paint the bodies upon all polished surfaces, on the retina of the eye, for instance, on water, on glass. Mirror, glass. The elementary spirits have studied to fix these transient images. They have composed a most subtle matter, very viscous and proper to harden and dry, by the help of which a picture is made in the twinkle of an eye. They, so the elementary spirits, do over with this matter a piece of canvas and hold it before the objects they have a mind to paint. The first effect of the canvas is that of a mirror. There are seen upon it all the bodies, far and near, whose image the light can transmit. But what the glass cannot do, the canvas, by means of the viscous matter, retains the images. The mirror shows the objects exactly, but keeps none. Our canvases show them with the same exactness and retains them all. This impression of the images is made the first instant they are received on the canvas, which is immediately carried away into some dark place. An hour after, the subtle matter dries, and you have a picture so much the more valuable as it cannot be imitated by art nor damaged by time. We take in their purest source, in the luminous bodies, the colors which painters extract from different material and which time never fails to alter. The justness of the design, the truth of the expression, the gradation of the shades, the stronger or weaker strokes, the rules of perspective, all these we leave to nature, who, with a sure and never erring hand, draws upon our canvases images which deceive the eye and make reason to doubt whether what are called real objects are not phantom, which impose upon the sight, the hearing, the feeling, and all the senses at once. One last quote. So he looks at it for a while and is fascinated. Meanwhile, I could not take off my eyes from the picture. A sensible spectator who from the shore beholds a tempestuous sea feels not more lively impressions. Such images are equivalent to the things themselves. The prefect interrupted my ecstasy. So I want to draw from this quote. Mind you, it's 1760, so about 50 years before, more than half a century before photographs were actually produced. Four features of his description. And what I find interesting in this author, Yves Citton, is not so much that he has intuition about technologies which will happen. He was not the only one to foresee things like that. But it's the way he already sees or intuits consequences of this. And these consequences, I suggest, are for him. First, what's characteristic of, let's call it photography, even if it's an anachronism, is its automaticity. Physical impressions by the rays of light themselves, by nature, by the things themselves. It's a representation without the intermediation of human subjectivity. It came late, we have more sheets. No. So, automaticity. Second point, authenticity. Such images are equivalent to the things themselves. We will see in Simondon the notion of a charge of reality. It is reality itself that paints itself on these surfaces, and these are authentic images. They are just like the things themselves. As third feature, I introduce a word taken from Bruno Latour. You know, Bruno Latour worked in the history of science and making us think differently about modernity. Bruno Latour proposes to use this term of factiche in English. In French, it's fétiche, F-A-I-T-I-C-H-E. So in English, factiche. And what is a factiche? It's the mixture of a fact and a fetish. And Bruno Latour's general view is that modernity built itself by opposing, on the one side, facts. We moderns, we civilized people, we advanced people, we have the technology, we have science. Technology and science are based on facts. We have facts. Savage, primitive people, they believe in strange gods, they're superstitious, they believe in fetishes. And from the 18th century on, modernity was built on this dichotomy. Either you know facts, and it's directly nature, and it's knowledge, it's not a matter of belief, it's a knowledge, and it's not produced by you. Nature gives you fact, and you're modern. Or you're primitive, you're pre-modern, and you believe in gods, in fetishes, which we modern know are produced by men. They've fabricated these fetishes, these gods, these idols, and so forth. Now, Latour wants us to see that this dichotomy fools us. We can't operate like that. We think we operate like that, but we don't. So, if you want to read Latour, I can give you references later. What I'm interested in is this notion of us having to deal with a mixture of a fact and a fetish. And I will, through the different readings I will propose to you, we'll see this idea that a photograph is both a fact and a fetish. I think that, for me, that helps me to figure out what it is. So, in Tiphaine de la Roche, we just saw that sketched when he said, Photographs make reason doubt whether real objects are not phantoms. Photography transforms reality into something which could be fooling us. We don't know what is real. Everything becomes maybe an illusion. Everything becomes maybe fabricated. Tiphaine de la Roche also talks a lot about simulacra. At the end of the quote, remember, he's in ecstasy. So, photography, as described before it was invented by Tiphaine de la Roche, shows it as non-human reality painting itself and as casting a doubt on the reality of our reality. Hence my use of the name factish taken from Bruno Latour. The last thing appears very delicately here. It's when he talks about phantom. What I'm interested in following readings is to add as a fourth feature the fact that photography has to do with the living dead. So I don't know much about history of photography. I just took things from the internet. This is supposed to be one of the first imprints, photographical imprints, Nicéphore Niepce, view from the window at Le Gras, around 1826, and this is supposed to be, but I don't know, I don't guarantee, the first human self-portrait from Cornelius, so more than half a century after Tiphaine de la Roche wrote his narration. Now, I'm getting into maybe better charted territory, especially if you're following classes with Phil, probably. An article by André Bazin, so who died in 1958, and the article is from 1945, about the ontology of the photographic image. And I'm going to take my 4 categories and just remind you of what Bazin says in this article, which is the same category I use for Tiphaine de la Roche. Automaticity. For the first time, an image of the world, so he's describing what changes with the advent of photography. For the first time, an image of the world is formed automatically without the creative intervention of man. So it's caused by rigorous determinism. This production by automatic means has radically affected our psychology of the image. It's not just something having to do with technology. It changes the way the images work, or we relate to reality and we believe or don't believe in reality. The objective nature of photography confers on it a quality of credibility absent from all other picturing. So, automaticity leading to more credibility. Authenticity, again a quote from Bazin, the photograph as such and the object in itself share a common being after the fashion of a fingerprint. So, the model behind this would be that of a fingerprint. Photograph is just like a fingerprint. Wherefore, photography actually contributes something to the order of natural creation instead of providing a substitute for it. So let's just keep the idea of photographic imprint as modeled according to a fingerprint. This notion of factishism, of factish, the picture, the photograph being a factish, I think we can find it in Bazin also. He's talking about surrealists, but I think he makes a more general statement. We should not consider the aesthetic purpose and the mechanical effect of the image on our imaginations as things apart. Okay? The aesthetic purpose and the mechanical effect of the image on our imaginations should be thought of together. The logical distinction between what is imaginary and what is real tends to disappear, says Bazin. It's sort of echo to Tiphaine de la Roche we read earlier. Every image is to be seen as an object, and every object as an image. Remember earlier, Tiphaine said things are equivalent, images are equivalent to things, and so forth. Last thing in this feature for Bazin, photography produces an image that is a reality of nature, namely, says Bazin, an hallucination that is also a fact. Okay, the photograph is an hallucination that is also a fact. My category of fact and fetishes, I think, works pretty well here. Now, last thing, which will become even stronger with Barthes, my next reading, which is already here in Bazin. This essay by Bazin is very short, but he seems to be obsessed with corpses, with traces left by dead people. The point of saying, photography carries the disturbing presence of lives halted at a set moment in their duration. Photography just fixes a life, it's a still, and yet it makes us feel that this life continues towards death, and we have something that we keep of this becoming dead. Cinema The moving photograph, he says, is changed, mummified. Yves Citton. Roland Barthes, my last author, I will just use to frame the problem before entering into Gilbert Simondon. Again, a lot of you know about Roland Barthes, Caméra lucida, la chambre claire. The way he treats photography is linked, I think, directly to these four categories I had. What is the trademark of a photography for Barthes? In French, ça a été. This was, this has been, this took place, this was reality. Ça a été. As you may know if you read some of Caméra lucida, Barthes is obsessed with the relation between photography and death. What photography reproduces infinitely only took place once. Of each subject that is photographed, I can say that it or he or she will die. He comments on this photograph by Alexander Gardner of a portrait of Louis Spain who is about to be executed. He says, this photo is beautiful, so is the boy. This is the studium, the content, if you want, the picture. But the punctum is what punctures us, what touches us, what affects us. He is going to die. I read simultaneously, this has been, it's from the previous century, and this will be, he is about to be executed. Photography tells me about death in the future. What punctures me is this equivalence. Another picture, I think it's little Roland and his mom. So he's talking about another photograph, I think, of his mom, but it could work with this one. Looking at the photograph of my mother as a child, I tell myself, she will die. I shudder to think of a catastrophe which has already taken place. He writes his text just after his mother died. Whether the person is already dead or not, any photograph is this catastrophe, this passage from being alive when the photograph was taken to being dead, either already done or it will happen, and we know it will happen when we watch a photograph, Barthes says. An image like this, little Roland with his mummy, seems to me to illustrate very well why a photograph can be or is often a factish, both a fact and a factish. This is a fact. Roland Barthes and his mummy were taken at some point in their history, and yet, if you think you are that kid, this is more than a fact. This, the fact that somebody like your mom was holding you in your arm and you're holding onto her, yes, it's a fact, but it has to be something else than a fact, and I think the category of a fetish works pretty well here. Now, this having been said, I can go into Gilbert Simondon, which I want to present today. Does everybody have a sheet? Yeah. All right. So, 2 words on Simondon, and then I'm just going to give you quotes, since I assume you don't know his work, and all the more because I translated an excerpt from a book which hasn't been translated into English. So these are my translations, whatever they're worth. But this is material that probably you haven't been exposed to. So I thought, I would go a bit slowly and pedagogically to make you understand how Simondon takes these problems and reframes them in, I think, an interesting way. So Simondon, he was known mostly because he had some influence on Gilles Deleuze. He wrote 2 major books. One of them is in French, Du mode d'existence des objets techniques, 1958, on the mode of existence of technique. What is it in English? I didn't translate that. I didn't check the translation. Of the mode of existence of technical objects. Okay, techne. It's one of the great thinking about technicity, very different from Heidegger and from what we used to read about technology, and I think very powerful. So that's one of his main contribution is this 58 book on technicity, and another one is he wrote 2 dissertations, 2 theses. His other thesis on theory of individuation. It's the best cure or the best antidote against our sort of latent individualism. Oh, we are individuals, and when we vote, it's me voting freely for so and so and so forth. The way he helps us understand individuals is as processes. There are no such things as individuals. There are processes of individuation, and at all levels, at the physical level, psychological level, collective level, social level, whatever, and he helps us understand these processes of individuation. I leave that aside for now. I'm going to concentrate all my quotes on one book that was very recently published, 2 years ago, I think, which is a course that Simondon gave in 65-66 on imagination and invention. And what I'm interested in, the quotes I will give you, deal with this issue. What is an image within Simondon's system, and how does it operate? What's its power? What's its agency? Now, first thing you have to understand is that what Simondon calls an image has 3 different phases. And if you understand that, then you're okay. So I'm going to take some time to go over these. The first phase, we usually don't see it as an image, but it's crucial to understand what it means. It's an a priori phenomenon. Before you even see an image, there is something in you which Simondon calls sensory motor tendencies. A sensory motor tendency. I'm going to give you 2 examples. First one is all of us. We were born at some point. Before we knew what was a bottle, before we had an image of a bottle, of a nipple, of anything, we came with this. I assume. And I think we wouldn't be here if we didn't come with this. So before there was an interaction between our body and some object in the world, there was a sensory motor tendency, which is to open your mouth and to suck. And I guess that's why we're here. So that's he doesn't say that. I'm trying to explain what he says, because it's a bit cryptic sometimes. If I show you this, okay, so there's an exchange between light, your eyes, your system, and so forth, you recognize it's a pen or a pencil. Now, before I showed you the pen, there was something in you, if you're a right-handed person, that knowing that you take a pen like this with your right hand, or with your left hand, or some people take it like this, or some people. There is pre-existent to seeing this very pen. There is something in you which Simondon would call a priori, a sensory motor tendency, which is that you've used pen instead of in order to write. So there is something physical that comes from you geared towards action that pre-exists looking at this particular pen. That's the first phase of the image for Simondon. The second phase is much more intuitive. It's the exchange that you have between your eyes and this. So it's a moment of contact between you, a perceiving subject, and this material object. And there's assimilation of information. You realize it's black as opposed to red. If you look at it closely, there will be some defects here. It's half full. So you learn things in an exchange of information with the object, and that's traditional perception that we have. Third phase is also not that surprising. Memories. I hide my pen, and you have a certain memory, vague because you're not very interested, of what you saw. It's a pen, it's black, and so forth. So in Simondon's word, you would say it comes a posteriori, after the exchange and the interaction with the object, and it's effectively charged imprints, things that are printed in you, which the subject carries with him or with her after the encounter with the object. And you see that the 3 phases are organized in such a way that in the first one you are geared towards an action, writing, sucking, doing something. Second phase, it's an assimilation of information between you and the object. Third phase, Simondon says, and I won't develop that, but that's most of his book actually. If you want in the question and answer, we can go into that. The third phase, these memories, it's a matter of reconfiguring the information that you've just assimilated. So 3 phases and the image is all of these 3 things. It's not just one. It's not phase 2 or phase 3. The image is the fact that these 3 phases are all necessary for an image to exist in human beings. Now, in order to explain what images are, Simondon also goes back to the origin of the word symbol. Symbol goes back to the Greek, and some of you may know that in Greek, symbolon meant one of the, something like that, a piece of ceramics. That what he explains. Symbols are like these pieces of ceramics which travelers in antiquity split in 2 before leaving their host, and of which they kept a half. Their offspring, in order to revive and authenticate the relations of hospitality, would bring their half of the broken piece, would present it in front of the other half in order to reconstitute the broken unity. So a symbolon, etymologically, is something like basically an ID card, or again, fingerprint. It's a way of marking identity by taking a piece of ceramic, breaking it, you keep one half, and there's another half somewhere in the world that will fit back with it. And if it comes back, it means you are the son of that person who 30 years ago came and had an exchange of hospitality with me. Is that clear? Yeah, should I ask you if it's clear? Symbolon, my 3 phases, otherwise I slow. Yeah, 3 phases, you okay? Cool, thanks. If you're not, stop me. So, Simondon will tell us images. What happens in these 3 phases of the image is the building of a symbolon in our head. And images are symbolon that we keep in our mind. We will name symbols these images, these memories, image memories, which result from an intense exchange between a subject and a situation. Okay, that's why it was important to figure out the first phase. We don't just encounter images like this. We're always doing something. We're always worried about something. We always invest affects and desires and appetites and action in things. And it is within this context of activity, of agency, that we encounter images. So, memories which result from that, they result from some form of exchange, and often intense exchange between a subject and not just objects, but a situation. Having strongly participated in an action, in a situation, the subject has given something of himself to this reality. Conversely, he retains an image dense enough to be like a fragment of the reality of the situation, like a symbol, like something that has been broken. Each time you live a moment, you build a relation or a situation, and when you keep a memory, it's a broken part of that situation, of that relation, that you carry with you. But there's another broken part of it, which was this reality. Conversely, he retains an image dense enough to be like a fragment of the reality of the situation, which allows him to reactivate it with this broken part that you have in your mind. You can recover, reactivate some of the situation. Such is the memory of a fight, of a great danger, of a house in which one has lived. So, a charge of reality coming from the situation, the real situation, is carried by the image. And in order to refer to that, I will suggest we use the word relation. Okay? It's a relation to a situation. You are part of a situation, and you keep a part of this reality, real situation in you, in the form of an image. Hence, images have an objective light. They're not just a subjective reality. They have an objective form of light. They exist not necessarily independently, but as I said, they cannot be governed by our subjectivity or our desire freely. They are part of this situation which was exterior to us, and we keep a bit of this exteriority in our mind as we work with these images. Images can only be governed in an indirect manner. They keep a certain opacity, like a foreign population within a well-organized state. You will go back to this, you will call it, you see later, a quasi-organism, etc. So we have to think of images as something that lives in us. They live in us. They're something exterior that live in us that we can use, we can mobilize, but they resist to our attempt and our desires, and they invade us, or they occupy us, just like an army can occupy a country. Containing a certain measure of will, appetite, and movement, images almost appear as secondary organisms within the thinking being. Against the unity of the person, they can be a seed of duplication, make you schizophrenic. But they can also bring the reserve of their power and implicit knowledge when problems need to be solved. You have bits of reality in you that you can use in order to solve new problems. This dimension, both objective and subjective of the images, corresponds to the status of quasi-organism which the images possesses, inhabiting within the subject and developing itself in him with relative independence towards his unified conscious activity. This objective existence of the image and this agency that images have within us, they are what Simondon called a charge of reality, and they bring a resistance due to the concreteness of the image. Concreteness meaning they come from a real situation. The charge of reality carried by this image makes them, I quote again Simondon, resist against our free will. It makes them refuse to let themselves be directed by our will, to present themselves according to their own forces, inhabiting consciousness again like a quasi-organism, like an intruder who disturbs the order of a house in which he is not invited. Hence, and this is the word I use, Simondon may not, the power of an image comes from its relation, from the fact that it is an imprint, symbolon, resulting from a concrete relation. Yeah. Let me go more into this idea of a charge of reality, which will summarize what Simondon has said so far with his three phases. And now I'm going to stop, and if you want to ask me a question, it would be a good time. Okay, what is an image for Simondon? The synthesis made of an equal proportion of endogen motor energy, what he called earlier sensory motor tendency. You always relate to images with things to do, or with things to want, or with things to be afraid of. So first you have your appetite, your desires, your fears, your affects, and this is how you apprehend the images. So the synthesis comes in equal proportion from this motor energy, sensory motor tendencies that come from you, phase one, of information coming from the environment, from the contact with the object itself. And this becomes a concrete symbol, the symbolon we're talking about, of the relation between the subject and his environment. This particular mix, and that's phase three, the memory, represents a point of insertion of our mental activity in our environment. The memory we keep in mind, and Evelyn worked a lot on memory, so you can prove Simondon wrong in 2 sentences. I'm counting on you to do that in the talk. The particular mix, phase three, this memory, represents a point of insertion of our mental activity in our environment. It condenses a situation. It conserves it with its network of forces and tendencies. What is a situation? It's a network of forces and tendencies, and it is this network of forces and tendencies which is condensed and conserved in the image that inhabit our mind. And it makes it possible to recall it, this network of forces and tendencies, and make it reappear. Are you totally lost?
No.
No? Good. Am I just saying 50 times the same thing? No? I go faster? Yeah? No? Alright, I'll move on. Just stop me. Now, these images, if you follow me and Simondon on how to understand them, they propagate. They propagate in various forms. And that's why we're going to say they occupy us like an army, or they invade us, or they are quasi-organisms. They reproduce. An intermediary reality between the abstract and the concrete, and that's a crucial thing for Simondon. Okay. Images are intermediaries between subjective, objective, between abstract and concrete, between the ego and the world. The image is not only a mental reality. So far I just said, oh, it's in our mind. Yes, it is in our mind. But it also materializes outside. It materializes. It institutionalizes itself. It becomes a product, a commodity. It spreads through commercial networks and through the mass media which broadcast information. Once they are materialized and objectified, images constitute a charge and command, a charge of reality, and command attention which partially determines social development. One example that Simondon takes is the circular causality that revolves around cliches and stereotypes. And Evelyn and I are of Swiss origin here, so I hope nobody else, we can badmouth the Swiss. My example would be, Swiss people are clean, or Switzerland is clean. Okay? And I have my theory about why Switzerland is clean, and it goes like this. There's a cliche. You think maybe that Switzerland is a clean country. So when you go to Switzerland, you tend to pay attention to it being more or less clean. You perceive differences. When you go to Turkey or Alaska, maybe you don't think about it because you haven't been geared to pay attention to cleanliness. So when you go to Switzerland, you pay attention to this. You think, oh, Switzerland is a clean country. So you alter your attitudes and your behavior. Usually you throw your cigarette butts in the street. In Switzerland, you won't. Because you think, oh, Swiss people are clean, so I won't throw my trash, etc. Which has as a result that less cigarette butts are thrown in the street. These behaviors create a situation which is that Switzerland is clean. And when other people come to Switzerland, their perception is that of a clean country. Now, Marina can tell you that Swiss people are not clean. It's just because all the foreigners who come to Switzerland think it is clean, behave as if it should be kept clean, that it ends up in the reality being clean. So this is the type of circular causality that will show you how just a mental image realizes itself or materializes itself in behavior. Again, phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3 are intimately connected, and how images are more than just mental reality. Now, one thing I like in Simondon is that he tells us, he specifies, why do we need images? And he says we need images in order to make choices. We make choices with images. As an intermediary between the abstract and the concrete, the subjective, the objective, the ego and the world, and so forth, as an intermediary between the abstract and the concrete, the images synthesizes a few features, motor, cognitive, and affective charges. We've seen that already. That's why it makes choice possible. Since each image, remember, as a symbol, as a broken part of a situation within which we were engaged, each image has a certain weight, a certain force, and since one can weigh and compare images, but one cannot weigh or compare concepts or perceptions as well. He will tell us right away why. Abstract thinking, concepts, work as a brake, as a means of refusal. I will not do this because it's not ethical, because for some conceptual reason. So conceptual reasons are good to prevent us from doing a number of things. Abstract thinking calculates and reveals inconveniences, remote consequences, etc. So abstract thinking is good for that, preventing us from doing a number of things. Perceptions, on the other hand, they lead us to be carried away by the situation. We are part of a situation, we tend to be carried away by it. Only the image, in the three phases, in the symbol and all the things I've been describing so far, only the image has a potential for regulation since it is abstract enough to detach the subject from the grip of the situation. It's abstracted very literally because we have this broken part of a symbol in our mind, and we work from that broken part and not from the situation itself, so we are a little bit detached. And yet, it allows us to choose because it is concrete enough to provide a trustworthy sample of reality. Not just something we build. It is part of reality, which is in our mind as this broken symbol. Now, if we had more time, I would go into the fourth phase of the image for Simondon, which is the phase of invention. As I told you, the book is called, the course was called Imagination et Invention. So far we discussed the image. Simondon is very interested in the fourth phase, which is the fact that in these image memories, they coexist within our mind as individual or within our collective mind within a society. These images which inhabit the subject, collective or individual subject, interact with each other. They feel some form of pressure to be compatible with each other, so they are recombined in more or less original manners. They mutate during this process, and this is this process of coexistence, compatibility, conflict, mutation, reorganization, recombination of memories in our individual and collective mind, which explains for invention, according to Simondon. If you want, we can go more on that. I leave the quote which you have there, you can read them at home. I just want to summarize this bit and then go in my conclusion, and then we can discuss. So, I think what Simondon tells us comforts this notion of factish, the image being both a fact, part of a real situation, and some sort of a fetish with an agency of its own. Okay? An image is not only a secondary imitation reproducing reality. Could be that. But it's also a direct, a primary, an automatic, an authentic fragment of reality, a block of reality, the symbolon that we keep in our mind. Hence, an image has a life of its own. When we talk about quasi-organism, we talk about germs also, germe in French, more like seeds, virus. It inhabits us like a foreign population. It lives in us and through us. It, the image, has an agency of its own, again. We can find the notion of automaticity. Okay, an image is an imprint, according to Simondon. It is the situation of which I was a part of that has been broken, and I keep an imprint as a symbol in my mind. The notion of authenticity. The image is a real fragment of reality. That's what you're saying. It's not a representation. It's a bit of reality, a bit of alien reality that I carry with me. It's both, hence, an authentic fact, as part of reality, and a magic fetish with an agency of its own, which exceeds our control. That's what Latour is very interested about, is if we know that we work with factishes, we have to be wary about them. When we were modern, or if we behave as moderns, we think, oh, facts, we can do whatever we want with facts. We can control them with technology. With factishes, we should be aware. We don't know what they can do. They may have some unforeseen, miraculous properties, and what we know is that they escape from our individual control. And why Latour is building the notion of factish is for to push moderns to behave with more care and to behave with more prudence, if you want, in their interaction with each other or with the environment. Last feature of my 4 features I gave you from the beginning, the living dead, or the image of a living being, also for Simondon, it's a carrier of something that emanated from the person as alive. It's a relation that we could have with that person as he or she was alive, which is kept in the picture, and it's this person as alive and as going towards death, which remains in the photograph that we showed of Barthes, for instance, and his mother. Now, 5 minutes more. Oh, I didn't tell you. For dessert, I have a short excerpt of a film. I should have promised you earlier. I'm sorry, I was so stupid to obviously. So 4 minutes of a film at the end. But before that, just a final opening on, does this business, this construction of the image by Simondon help us to reconfigure the distinction between analog images and digital images? For instance, this picture I showed you earlier, apparently it was taken, the one on the left, in the British Channel on February 5th, 2011. So it's a picture of what a fact that really happened somewhere in the British Channel on that date, whereas the other picture is virtual reality produced by computers and programs, etc., etc. Instead of analog and digital, photographic image on one side, the way Bazin was theorizing on its ontology, and computer-generated images on the other side. For me, the main difference would be the distinction between an imprint, something that's printed on us. Okay? Bazin was talking about fingerprints. Simondon was talking about the symbols. Okay? Reality, we're part of reality, and something's broken. So, imprint on one side, as opposed to program on the other side. And I'm thinking, for me it makes sense. I don't know about you, but for me it makes sense, because imprint, there's something about printing. Graphane, it's to write. So in a way, printing, writing, it's the same thing. What's different is the imprint comes from the outside and prints itself on the surface. program writes, also print writes, but writes towards the future, or writes something that's downstream, if you want. And I will take as the model of imprint what we just saw within Simondon as his theory of the symbolon, the image as symbolon, what I call the relation. And because I'm not familiar with this domain at all, but I just discovered Lev Manavix's books on the language of new media, and I love it, so I'm just using this. 4 of the operations that Lev Manavix says are defining. Or he said that 2001, so maybe it all changed by now. I don't know, I'm not very up to date. But that was inspiring to read his book on 4 operations that are specific to the new media. And we can oppose them, I think, quite easily. On the imprint side, it's the notion of rawness, authenticity, if you want. Something gets printed on. And take the image of just an analog photography. Okay. This raw reality, raw something printed on a surface. As opposed to filtering. In the programmation, it all works with filtering. On the imprint, you have the encounter with an alien, with alterity, with something again that resists, that's not you. And I stupidly play with words. Phil has nothing to do with that, I must say. Hospitality, I thought it was nice because in French, maybe you know that un hôte is a curious word because it goes both for the host and the guest. So when you say il est mon hôte, you don't know if it's he's my guest or he's my host. Which on the one hand is very confusing because you would make, that's one of the basic things in language, is to make a difference between passive and active, who's host, who's guest. And yet I think it's beautiful that French confuses them. And in English it works well because if you put guest and host, it makes ghost, which fits nicely with my Living Dead story, you know? And I think there's an intuition here, the imprint, it's a way of negotiating, of dealing with alterity, with alien. It's a way to welcome or to beware of reality being exterior to me, in me. Remember this symbolon, which is this intruder living in me. So that would be specific to the imprint, as opposed to, on the program, again, Lev Manavix is clear on that, what you do with programming, most of the time, because very few of us are programmers actually, we select from pre-established menus. So we can do all these things. We can variate the image, we can change the color, we can change the size, we can change infinite variation, and yet infinite variation from pre-established menus. So there has been a pre-filtering, there have been programs that are already written that, in a way, corrupt the access, the encounter with the ghost, or the host, or the guest, or this alien thing intruding. Obviously, the imprint has time fixed, as opposed to programming, which can change constant variability, and clearly enough also, the analog type of photography represent non-pre-segmented, again, fragments, frames of reality or of images, as opposed to modular compositing on the side of the program and Manavix's new media. Now, Phil and I are thinking about this maybe in relation with Straub et Huillet. So if some of you have seen a movie by Straub et Huillet, Jean-Marie Straub and Daniel Huillet, we're interested in these movies and we think there's something to do a bit differently with them. And I think one of the things we could do is to claim them as vindicating or denouncing the ontological poverty of the program, of programming. If you read Manavix's text, he insists very often on the fact that the new media tend to offer us pre-established path to follow. It seems to give us all that freedom, and yeah, we can do whatever we want with an image, and it's great. And yet, our menus are preset. The selection are from things that are already established for us. Whereas the imprint offers us a promise of sort of uncharted territory, of unfiltered data. Maybe a fantasy, I'll see that later, but maybe something to cherish also. In the new media, in the programming, the severing of this relation, okay, the symbol in symbol as part of a real situation that continues to live in me. With the programming, you go through a severing, separation from this relation, which diminishes the agency or the power of the image, whereas the imprint offers us not only certain fixity, promise of fixity, but also a resistance, an alterity, which we equate, I think, often with the real. The real is what resists to transformation, variability, etc., etc. I don't know if it works for you. If I see these two things, I can think that the one on the right is a nice painting of Hugo, and why not? Just to think that Victor Hugo himself was taken in a picture, and that what I see here, even if it's been digitalized, I don't know about you, but I'm moved by this more than by that. And he's not my grandmother, and if he was my cat or my grandmother, that would be even stronger. Here, I don't know, I find this moving, and I'm just trying to account for what moves us. It's not original because Bath and a lot of people were doing already. We can inscribe, I have just 2 or 3 more slides, I think. We can inscribe this in, maybe, in a questioning of the notion of authenticity. And you know that it's sort of a dead horse. You see that? Beat on a dead horse. Adorno, Charles Taylor, I mean, every 5 or 6 years a debate about authenticity comes back. Oh, we desperately need authenticity in this modern world where everything is fake. And then people say, oh, authenticity, great, it's what consumers want. So obviously it's recycled and used to sell you things in the name of authenticity. And then you have Andrew Potter coming and talking about the authenticity hawks. All of our world now is going to pieces because we're foolish enough to think about something like authenticity, and we get lost trying to find ourselves. So behind this recurrent debate about, oh, modern people need something authentic to cling to, otherwise they're lost, I think there are a number of things we can observe. Just the thirst or the desire or the appeal of organic food, of AOC, I don't know what is English, appellation d'origine contrôlée, whatever that for wine. Okay, so just to traceability, and you want to make sure that it comes from a small vineyard in France and not from some big thing. For cheeses, for wines, autobiography. Why are we so fascinated with autobiography? Or TV reality shows. All of these could be put together in this thirst, more or less desperate for authenticity. Now, the question is it fundamentally conservative? Is it bad because it's conservative? Is it merely nostalgic, going back to the past? We're always sort of sad to be modern and wished we were more primitive or closer to nature or something. Is it reactionary? Is it ridiculous? And Phil and I want to think about, for this, about Schraube-Millet. I think there is something conservative in Schraube-Millet, who's supposed to be the avant-garde. Is this conservatism reactionary, ridiculous, or is it the exploration of a particular form of agency? Doesn't Simondon maybe sketch something which is the agency of the image as an imprint, which maybe people like Schraube-Millet, or maybe a certain attitude towards photography and towards the certain cult of the imprint could be a form of trying to recover this agency. Now, two more slides. Of course, it's not a matter of believing that a photograph is the real. Bazin had a lot of sort of a period where he was looked down upon as naive. What I try to sketch with Simondon as realism or relationism is a mode of relating to the image as an imprint, but it's a mode of relating. It's not to say that it's the photograph itself is reality. It's a matter of perceptual attitude. Stephen Prince talked about perceptual realism. It's a matter, I think, very clearly of socio-historical expectation. What do we expect when we look at a picture, when we go to the movies? Maybe cinema, as all the folks like Phil and I knew it, is a historical, maybe passé sensitivity geared towards experiencing this relation. It's clearly a matter of contract. You have a realist contract in the novel, a referential contract in the novel, a fictional contract in the novel. You may have a relationist contract within a certain period of cinema, but I would suggest in conclusion that it may be an aesthetic experience. It's a certain aesthetic that we can cultivate and give value to. Beyond the notion of authenticity as a hoax or not as a hoax, we're interested in something that could maybe be called the grain of the real. And for me, the model to think of the grain of the real would be noise music. Okay, something, a sensory realism or sensory relationism for which noise music would be a model. What happened is that the digital technology made the analog distortion of sound, the scratch on a record, or the white noise on a tape, because of the digital technology that can erase these things, it transformed noise into something that you can choose and that you do actually enjoy. The whole trend of lo-fi, low-fidelity aesthetics in music and in film can be, I think, staged against the same background. There's an emotion carried by the grain, by seeing the grain, by enjoying the materiality of the mediation, which I think is very far removed from any form of naive realism. And maybe a certain experience of cinema, cinéphile, what people call in French cinéphile, would be an enjoyment and an experience of this grain of the real. And I just wanted to give you 4 minutes of a movie I really like by Michael Haneke called Code Inconnu, Unknown Code, from I think the year 2000. And just to think of, I mean, I don't particularly despise Avatar. It's a movie like any other, computer-generated images, and why not? This is not to say, oh, we should only do movies this way and all the rest is not interesting, obviously not. Just I want to show you one scene of Michael Haneke, because I think it's both a non-naive presentation of all the themes I gave you now, and a search for some form of authenticity within the context of somebody playing a role, which I find interesting. So I just need a little procedure to get out of that and get into the other one. And let me just introduce the scene in telling you, for those of you who may not have seen the movie. Oh wait, how do you? Yes. So Code Inconnu is made of, I don't know what it is, plan séquence. Plan séquence. Long takes. Okay, one-shot takes. Okay, except for 1-2 exceptions, it's 40 or 50 one-shot takes. That's the rule of the game that Haneke gives himself, which originally are totally scattered. So you see things happening. There's one scene at the beginning that mixes the different stories, and then you move into different spaces, different storylines, and so forth. And this, what we will see just after this scene with the cab driver, which seems to have nothing to do with the following one, is Juliette Binoche. All we know is that she's an actress, and she's doing some testing to see whether she will be taken in that film or not. So somebody's producing a movie, Juliette Binoche is an actress, she goes there, and she doesn't know where she is or what she's doing. She just, people are supposed to tell her what to do so that she has a chance to be chosen as an actress in that movie.
So,
it all goes in black, and then you have the scene which is.
Non, là, je pense que c'est là, ça je le texte aussi, vous laissez.
Est-ce que tu peux parler
Je suppose.
un peu plus précis?
Bon, très bien. Comme ça, nous n'avons pas besoin de béquilles. Nous commencerons au moment où il vient juste de l'enfermer. La caméra, c'est la porte. Comme ça, vous pourrez jouer directement vers moi. Luc, on est prêt? Je suis prêt. Ok. Vous voulez qu'on vous donne la réplique?
Je veux bien, merci.
Bon. Ready?
Ready.
Vous croyez l'avoir entendu fermer la porte et vous voulez vous en assurer. Elle est bel et bien fermée. La porte est verrouillée, vous ne sortirez plus d'ici.
Pardon?
Vous ne sortirez plus d'ici.
Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire?
Ça veut dire que vous allez mourir ici.
C'est une plaisanterie.
Pas pour moi. Pour vous non plus, je le crains. 1, voyez la fixation du luxe? Il y a une arrivée de gaz pour l'éclairage. Vous comprenez pourquoi tout à l'heure je vous ai demandé si vous aviez du feu. Si vous aviez du feu, vous pourriez nous faire sauter tous les deux.
Oh, que voulez-vous?
Rien. J'ai rien contre vous, absolument rien. Vous êtes sympathique. Vous êtes simplement tombé dans mon piège, c'est tout.
Bon, ça veut dire quoi ça? Je suis tombée dans votre piège.
Ça veut dire que vous allez mourir. Je veux simplement vous regarder en train de mourir.
Bon, s'il vous plaît, arrêtez. Vous êtes bien fait plaisir, maintenant. Vous oubliez tout ça et on arrête, d'accord? On attend à la maison, j'ai autre chose à faire. J'ai pas le temps de jouer.
Moi non plus, j'ai pas le temps de jouer, croyez-moi. Vous entendez ce sifflement? Ça vient du plafond. Bientôt vous allez sentir l'odeur. Montrez-moi votre vrai visage.
Quoi?
Ton vrai visage.
Mais c'est quoi ça? Vous voulez quoi?
Je veux voir ton vrai visage. Pas tes mensonges, des trucs. Une expression vraie.
Mais qu'est-ce que je dois faire?
Sois spontané. Réagis à ce qui t'arrive.
She's safe. Juliette Binoche, she's fine. It was just acting a scene to be taken in a movie and make a lot of money. And she got the role. So, can be rich. And that's the end. Any remarks? Questions?
So thank you very much, Yves. I have a question.
Yes.
During the Impressionist era of painting, how did were there methods of criminal investigation that happened through paintings to find evidence that had to be transformed over to photography? I mean, how did that change? How did the advent of photography in the 1800s affect the images that people continuously had from paintings? You know, they relied on certain elements of paintings that were, of course, not, as you said, objective, but always subjective. I mean, how? I'm starting to ask you 2 or 3 different questions. I don't want to do that.
And I won't have the answer. I'll tell you right away. So anybody can chip in.
That's something I've always wondered about the advent of photography, because we don't see a lot of pictures from the mid-19th century. We don't see a lot of. We have this image of the Impressionist time, the late 19th century. I always wanted to know how photography affected people's perceptions of life around them when they would romanticize about things, and how that element of truth, of objectivity, changed that. It's very, very interesting.
So apart from the trivial thing, which is to say that, oh, it's because of photography that the Impressionists show the inside perception instead of the external reality, traditional thing, which is the obvious answer and the one that's not satisfactory, because precisely you want to see more precisely what closer interaction there is between credibility, photography, and painting. And the images of Hugo, which is from that period that I showed earlier. Again, the painting is just as credible or as realistic as the photograph in a way. It's in color, so it might seem even more realistic, if you want. And yet, it's an assumption, or it's us projecting a certain contract and a certain expectation of imprint on the photography that generates emotions in me, for instance. But as far as I know, that photograph may have been digitally reconstructed by somebody who put it on the internet, and maybe it's taken from a painting of Hugo. So it's always me relating to an image as being a photograph being something that's an imprint, and then it produces an emotion. So all these mediations have to be reinstored.
So when we first look at a photograph of something and we're struck by it, even though we think we're seeing it for the first time, I often wonder what is the percentage of newness that's really happening and how much is brought and transformed by our memory of the impression which you brought up.
Right, yeah.
And when we look at science, so much of it is historical. And implanted in there, and we're not looking accurately, we're not getting the accurate perception of the image at all, but rather our history. Right. You know?
Yeah.
It's hard to look at something new. You don't look at anything new when you're bringing your history.
You look at cliché. I said I wouldn't quote Deleuze, but that's Deleuze's main thing about movie and Godard and all these people in this period. What we see is cliché, just cliché, and more cliché, and to produce an image to disrupt this habit of seeing things, of knowing before seeing that we know what we're going to see, and not seeing the thing itself, but the cliché that we have in our brain. Again, Godard and Deleuze theorize this as being the goal of movie making or cinema making, but achievable in very rare occasions.
Yeah.
What was your point with Juliette Binoche?
I'm sorry?
What was your point with Juliette
I'm not sure. I just thought it was, I always loved that scene, and I thought it was an interesting way of, well, let me say what my point is. I was thinking that this scene would have no interest whatsoever if it was made with computer-generated images. So you take Avatar type of producing, the Avatar section computer-generated, you could do exactly the same thing, same dialogue, same everything, and I wouldn't see any point in doing that scene. And I think that, but I don't know, for me that was, I wanted to see what your reaction was, so I will return the question to you, but I was thinking this, if I want to find a scene where something happened on the filming, on the shooting of that stage, between an actress and a camera, and it was imprinted, and Haneke insists on the fact that doing plan séquence, it's risky. This is not so spectacular, but I don't know if anybody saw the movie. At the beginning of Connu, you have about a 10-minute plan séquence in a street of Paris with 6 or 7 characters interacting in a very complex fashion. And he says, it's just hell to make such a movie, to make such a scene, because so many things can go wrong in 10 minutes of plan séquence that it costs a lot, it's a headache, and so forth. And yet he wants to do this because there is some, again, it could be very naive, there's reality in it, it's real time. And I want to put the spectator in a position of experiencing real time. So there's this reference to reality, to relation, to something that happened in front of the camera and was printed on the film. That is part of how Haneke conceives of making this particular movie. And I thought, I could have shown you the long scene, but that was not very interesting. I thought what was interesting is that you had this, you had the performance of an actress, and the performance of an actress was to obviously tell us that she wasn't about to die, because she's cast as an actress performing something to get a role, and yet some form of anxiety or uneasiness, for me, I don't know about you, goes through this scene, and I don't know, there's all this morbid fascination with women being just abused or mistreated, which is everywhere on television, it's everywhere in the movies. And this, for me, is one interesting way to address it, because it's just terror. Poor woman, she's terrorized. And that's what we want, because it's all over. So here he shows that. We know it's not the case. We know Juliette Binoche is fine. What he asks her is, show me your real face, I want to see you die, which is in a way also what we want. Sort of staging the desire, again, what we go to the movies with, what we bring to the movies or television, and staging it in a way that's both reality, an actress performing in front of a camera with the lo-fi thing that's it's moving and so forth, and a denunciation of another reality, which is what we bring before we see a picture. Apparently, we bring this desire, because that's what is told to us, and that's what's all over the screen. So I thought it was vaguely related, but I'm not sure. You don't see that?
I don't know. I need time.
I'm sorry?
I need time to.
Oh.
I don't know if the anxiety is related to the way the image, to the long, comment on dit conséquence? What is the word for conséquence?
Long take?
Or just because of the theme, you know, it's about a woman dying. So I don't know if it's really about, you know, the type of image or just because of the.
Well, that's my point also. There's something that filters through an anxiety that, again, that colonizes our brain. We can't just watch this and say, oh, this is an actress and this is. It's part of it and we know it. And yet there's something stronger that invades, intrudes our brain to make me feel very uneasy when I see that. So the charge of reality, not naive. What I was interested in is not naive. I mean, he puts a number of things telling us this is a movie, this is shooting, and so forth. And you have the non-naivete of this realism, and yes, this charge of reality that, in spite of it all, does something, including in spite of me.
But are you saying that because you think it's to some degree citing almost, let's say, picking up from the first picture you showed us? I thought that the more moving picture in the slideshow was the one that photo I've never seen, perhaps the first ever photographic self-portrait, which had an amazing aura on it. So you have that, and then you comment on the both picture, black and white, the both picture, and then you have an aesthetics. I mean, that's what you're talking about, aren't you? An aesthetics that echoes a relation to the image that is much closer to what Simondon is starting with, until he then says, but watch out, it's that very same thing that then becomes commodified and becomes the object of the manipulations that the digital enables to do. Yeah. But it was still not, it was still not very clear to me, and that's because I have no context with Simondon, whether he's actually talking. I mean, I know he's writing after Sartre, after the work on imagination and imaginaire. So, you know, and Sartre talks about something that he calls not l'image mentale, but he talks about l'image psychique. And to me it wasn't clear, I wasn't sure whether you wanted the to keep the terms fluid or whether Simondon does that as well. I mean, are we talking about mental images, or are we talking about, you know, what interests Sartre, which is how do we negotiate between a material set of colors and shapes that we then recognize as an image of Hugo, which would be, you know, some encounter with almost the chemistry of what makes those symbols available to us, whether it's the ink in the fingerprint or the reactive paper in the photograph. I mean, all of that suggests that the image could also be something of a very material order, or is he actually talking about the kind of image that you were talking about, which was initially, which is a photograph as well as the shots that make the movie. So I wasn't sure.
Well, I would say I'm not sure either. There is this uncertainty which interests me in Simondon, because as I was saying, his main, well, book on technicity is the other one on individuation attempts, it has 4 parts, and it tries to explain what is individuation on the physical, biological level. So we take crystals. How does a bath with a germ becomes a crystal? So individuation, you can talk about individuation in crystals. You can talk about individuation in coral reefs. So he starts at this level. And then he moves into a sort of what we call psychological level. And then he just adds layer to this. And then there's the collective level, a society, a community, a family. So my reading of his theory of the image is that he's trying to conceive of an image that would work both sort of inside of our mind, which was something I was often referring to, the symbol being inside of our mind and so forth. But yet there's another level of individuation which is collective, where it's not just inside of my mind and inside of your mind. It's propagates among us. And it propagates among us with photographs that we read in the newspaper, with movies, with television. But I don't know, maybe it doesn't work, but for me the challenge is to think the image and the agency of the image that would work on at least, I don't know about crystals, but at least for the sort of subjective psychological level that's something we are really interested in, and sort of collective level.
So it's about the technological reproduction. I mean, it is, you know, that enables the circulation of image. Because, I mean, going back to the question about painting, there was a time when the image was not even analog, it was a creation of a certain type of technique. Then it becomes an analog through mastery over a certain number of chemical processes and lenses, and we're now looking at another mode of technological reproduction. That helps, yeah.
Yes?
I was wondering maybe if there was a connection between what you were calling the a priori level of the image with Whitehead's prehension, potentially, or because I was wondering with the question of the mental image versus a material image, and in the case of something like a plant, like could we say that a plant has an image with its own agency of sunlight, and that it can tend towards when it grows to bend this way or that way for sunlight, or like almost the image as just like a set of configured I don't know the words.
I think it's a very good track. I'm not that, I know Whitehead indirectly. Gilles Deleuze wrote a good book on him, so I don't know, but I've seen the word prehension floating there, and it seems to me that it's a good track. And again, if you go then with downstream with Deleuze working with both people, that might very well be, but I couldn't tell you very precisely the difference between Whitehead's prehension and his first phase here. But I think it's a very good track. Yeah.
So it seems to me that the question of the agency of the image also has to do with frustrating interpretation in some way, or frustrating mastery of interpretation. And it seemed to me that this might be a point in common with Bazin about Simondon, whom I know better than I did an hour ago. So, well, but because Claude, when he talks about this image of his mother, one of the strong points of that book is he says, well, all these theories of interpretation, semiotics, the rhetoric of the image, or even history, all these discourses are a way of simply blocking the pure affect, right? Interpretation is what keeps me sane when I see this picture. Otherwise, I would just go insane. And I think that's not too. I mean, doesn't develop theories of interpretation so much, but he links the plan séquence to a kind of freedom of interpretation. Right? He never says exactly one thing, but as opposed to montage, where interpretation
your attention is guided to this and that and that.
Yeah, and Simondon kind of link between, is the theory of the agency of the image a link between this kind of unsettling relationship?
Doesn't talk at all about cinema, or he mentions it here or there, but he's not interested in cinema and techniques and so forth. So again, it's very just broad, sort of ontological description of images, and it doesn't go into these details at all. I see from listening to you the link with Barthes, with what you just said, what you mentioned in Barthes, with sort of interpretation, semiotics, sort of making opaque what is the first, and maybe more important effective on that. Simondon is one of the beauty of his conception is precisely to put the affective force at the heart of not only the image, but just the way we understand knowledge and we understand behavior. So to reinstate the affect. And again, then Deleuze, the emphasis that he puts on affect comes half from Spinoza and half, I think, from Simondon's emphasis on this. So this first phase of the image, the situation in which we are, I just quoted the sensory motor tendencies. That's what I gave. But as important is the affective investment. I was trying to say, fear or something. So that's situations in which we are affectively invested. And that's what determines the strength of this imprint. And then, again, when we look at images, even when they're on screen or when they're something else, it's this charge de réalité, this charge of reality, it's vector, it's clearly just emotions and affect. And whether he thinks about individuation at the psychological or collective level, he puts this at the very core of his analysis. And in this way that we merge with what Bach was saying. I think so, yeah.
I mean, that's what makes him really interesting to me, because the kind of model that he looks at, I think, the three parts, among other things, I can't remember how they went, but you know, the a priori, and the a presenti and the a posteriori, that kind of model is actually the one that the neuroscientists are working with now. That's, I mean, it sounded like neuroscience to
Right.
started.
Yeah.
But the difference is that the neuroscience cannot deal with affect. It will only recognize patterns of action and will provide an analysis that looks at images as the present, the past, and the future, as Modal seems to do, but without the ability to actually bring in affect. There's no charge to things. So there's no. It can't be ontological or philosophical because it remains at a mechanistic level. Action reaction.
Except people like Damasio, I mean, there are a number of
Well,
people like
that's
Damasio,
Damasio,
and
but
it's interesting that they also come from Spinoza, that they go back to
They
Spinoza
do.
and try to bring affect in the picture. But that doesn't satisfy you.
No, it doesn't satisfy you because they don't. When they talk about image, the image becomes affectless. You see, and that's why they can't get on with psychoanalysts. I mean, there's a big divide between, and they fend off. Though they, some of them have read a little bit, but they fend off anything that has to do with the way in which images carry affective charges. So it's not. It may look as if Damasio talks about emotion. He does. Of course, he talks about emotion and feeling. That's a different story, so to speak. But it does not. It's embodied always, and it doesn't talk. It doesn't translate into something that would explain what we're talking about in terms, let's say, of watching the scene.
As psychoanalysis would do.
As psychoanalysis might do, not it chooses to do other things quite often, but this is about Simondon, the ability to actually see that the process of image management, so to speak, that defines us in time, is something that is an affective charge, is backed much more than Damasio.
Yeah. And for this, Simondon is, I didn't answer properly the question, because in his theory of individuation, when he reaches the psychological level, the affect is a synonym for him with the relation. Relation, an affect, an emotion is not something which is in me. An emotion, an affect, it is the relation I have with this cat, with this building, with this something. So, relation is affect, and that's an extremely strong position in terms of ontology and other, and that's, that's
more
for me, that's one of the novelty and
than
that's one of the beauty of
Damasio.
Simondon. Right, yeah, that's much more radical than Damasio. Yeah. Yes?
I was wondering, maybe related to your remarks, what interested me was this term of Bruno Latour.
Factish.
Factish,
Yeah,
it's I have never heard it. So you stressed, on one part there's a fact which stands for the objectivity, so, and then the fetish. It seemed to me that you defined it as, what makes it special is the whole idea that photographic images somehow bring a sort of alien life within us, and this is an eerie, creepy thought, of course. So I thought maybe it would be more, the bridge could be made by this concept of the fetish, by not stressing the fact that it is alterity, but maybe that it is sort of alterity or heterogeneity, but the fact that we experience it or that we believe it to be a sort of alien organism invading our bodies. And from the moment when the beliefs comes in, that's where the affects starts. I think, and
denounced. Right, an illusion. Yeah.
And I think related to your remarks that, especially of course, fetish being very nice concept to approach psychoanalysis. And well, this is actually just a preliminary remark because I think the whole story seems to have a tension between either are we talking about ontology of images and something has changed in the images, which makes us nostalgic for whatever, or is it our attitude that has changed? Because if it is the attitude, we could just as well look at Avatar as something truly, heterogeneic, a true alterity, but because it's produced by someone. Well, it's not just a mere projection, and in that sense, it's just the same as say paintings or music or whatever. And we don't really need this idea of sort of physical connection with reality. As long as we experience something as coming from outside, and we believe that it can do something with us, nothing really seems to have changed. So, but on the other hand, your story seems to tell us that something has changed. It seems.
I'm not sure. So yeah, there were a lot of things
Sorry,
on the fact. No, that was right. That was great. I don't know if I was supposed to bring something because what you the trajectory that was quite interesting. There were just two things that I wanted to plug in, not to respond, just to plug in. One of the things Simondon evokes at the beginning of the course is what he calls a vult. I didn't know what a vult was. V-O-U-L-T. Apparently, a vult. None of you is practices witchcraft, I guess, because you know the vult. Apparently, when you practice witchcraft, you have. If you want to harm someone, one has to bring you a piece of hair of that person, or a piece of clothing. Hair apparently is better. And that's a vult. When you have a little bit of the person that you can work on, and because it was linked to that, it was the person's hair, then whatever you do on that thing, it will affect the person. There is a link. And so, and obviously Simondon is just as rationalist as you and me, so he doesn't particularly believe in witchcraft, and yet he just makes it surface the fact that having somebody's hair, it is part of the person. And to think of this as a model for the picture of Victor Hugo or my grandmother or my cat, well, for me it says something. There is something close to a vult in the picture. Now, you're asking, is it a projection or a convention, or is it part of the thing? Again, I think clearly it's a belief, because I don't know. I mean, for my cat, I know who was my cat. I know that it's a picture I took of my cat, so I don't have many doubts on somebody fiddling with the digital image to. So that's fine. This I know. Victor Hugo, as I was telling you, I don't know. I just ripped it from the internet. Maybe somebody composed a picture, a fake picture of Victor Hugo. So this, I wouldn't put my hand in the fire about that. So it is a matter of belief. Sometimes that belief is well anchored into arguments that I can construct. This is a picture of my cat, I know. Sometimes it's more fragile. So, but it's investing this belief that gives it the vult charge to the object. And now you say, is it a past time or is it nostalgia or something? I don't know. I think it's something that we don't need witchcraft, and we don't need. So maybe cinema, as I was describing, is like witchcraft. It's going to be passé in a few decades, and people will look at it. Oh, what did they believe in, or what did they experience? I'm not sure. I feel a certain emotion thinking, oh, something happened in front of the camera that could not be pre-programmed by somebody with a computer, and that I enjoy. It's not that it's better, it's just I enjoy. And we're thinking about this movie by Strauss-Bergier. I don't know if you're familiar with Strauss-Bergier. Sometimes it's just a character comes and reads, or just narrates pages from political theory, or pages from a tragedy in German, and nothing happens, just plan fixe. So you see that. But you see the wind in the trees. And for me, Straub is about the beauty of wind in the trees. And you could make an avatar computer-generated picture, and you really have a function put wind in the tree, you can do that. Somehow I project something else on Strawberry, which makes me enjoy the wind in the tree, and it would be meaningless in Avatar. But maybe it's the same thing as drinking wine. Maybe just because I think it is wine, I project something on it, or cheese, and it could be processed next door and have the same taste, and it's my illusion. I don't know. I think it's very arrogant for human beings and technology to think that we can totally mimic reality and that we're not going to lose something along the way. If we believe that, I think it's part of the modern arrogance that Latour is worried about also. So to assume that was on the poverty of the poverty of program, just to assume that in things that are printed upon us, coming from some form of outside, for which we have this relation of hospitality, with the dangers and the respect that's part of the relation of hospitality, I think ethically, it's a more interesting attitude. So I would bet for that. Remaining always very careful on the naivete that could be part of it. Yes,
Would you say that various effective images can be used in politics and nationalism and distortions of it?
Clearly. Politics, or just what we saw, just a scene with Juliette Binoche that was within a movie which is made, you should see, it's from one of my favorite movies. It's made to make us think differently about crime, about foreigners, about transgressing borders, about the fears we have with this moving world. So within this scene was sort of neutralized and became interesting for me. But when we see the same type of things day and night on television, whether in fictions or on Fox News because somebody was aggressed here or there, clearly, I mean, Simondon, I think, gives us tools to see what just nefarious effects it has, because we cannot not invest feelings and anxieties and fears and desires and hate in such images, so it spreads among us like cancer. So clearly, yeah. Oh, one more. Yes.
Maybe one last question. Yes. Actually, building on your question about this use of factors, I'm so interested in your discussion of images. You move very fluidly between still and moving images, and I was wondering if perhaps there's a possible way to talk. If we do want to use this Victorian factish concept, might we find a way to talk about the factish differently with respect to photography than with film? And I'm more familiar with the German context and really German film theory, but you definitely see this similar moments in say, Philip Balash and Hungarian film theories from the 20s and this country about the cinematic image is subjective, and he talks about things that sort of overlap a bit with Benjamin and sort of optical unconsciousness, where like the thing I see on the image, when I see the motion of a cigarette in a hand, I'm seeing that movement for the first time. And so it happens all the time, but in film I see it, I objectively experience that movement. But at the same time, that same moment is experiencing this cigarette as an object with a sort of dramatic role, almost personified. And he always talks about the close-up, so the cigarette in the close-up, it becomes like a character in the film. It has sort of a dramatic kind of agency with respect to other things that are going on in the film. We talked about this very frequently. So there's that sort of, that's the factish moment, a bit maybe in Balash. And I'm sort of, I don't know, I'm wondering with respect to the photograph where it really is more about fetish, because you're talking about indexicality and materiality of, it's a photograph that you can hold in your hand, it passes around, it's a memento, it's an actual physical object. With film you don't have that because you have the apparatus. Whereas, and I think Bazin talks about the difference between photo and film as fetish versus fetishizing, maybe. And so should film be considered, a sort of visual training for this kind of, we're seeing the agency of objects, whereas the photo is more about the agency of the image as such. I
Same thing. I mean, these are great tracks to explore, and thanks for bringing them in. Just a few ways to react to these very good suggestions. I was struck. so this guy I started with, Tiffaine de la Roche, nobody reads him. So I'm just working on him now, and maybe there are 10 people who have read his work and published a few articles here or there. And so it doesn't mean anything to say, oh, nobody noticed, because nobody reads it. But yet, just one person noticed something which made me think, is that, so the whole story is that he's in the desert and he sees this. And he hits his head against the painting because he thinks it's a window or and he sees the real thing. And obviously it's unbelievable because this is not moving. So none of us would think, oh, it's a real sea if you see this, which is a still. Precisely, it's a still. If the Esprit Élémentaire were showing a film of a moving ocean, then you understand you would be fooled. But the whole situation is very weird that he's fooled seeing this, because this doesn't look, it looks like a painting, maybe a higher definition painting, but not like the sea itself. So your question can be addressed also this way. I think, for me, the fact and fetish were both still and cinema. That's why I try to bring it to the notion of imprint. There's something about an imprint, and it can be an imprint in form of still, or this would start moving because it's a movie like Haneke's movie, and it would still be the logical imprint as opposed to the logic of programming. So I would say, on one hand, it's the same thing. And what we said about the affection that can be put in it, again, painting, a photograph of my cat or a film of my cat, the situation, the affectivity, that's part of it. I think that for me, I don't really see the difference. When you talk about close-up, I think you could say the same thing about photograph and about film. Close-up, the fact of being able to make a close-up just makes us discover bits of the real that we wouldn't see otherwise, with a photograph just as much as with a film. Now, clearly there are certain things that moving picture will make us sensitive to. Now, I don't see how that would be more fetishist there or not. If not, maybe I would be more moved by seeing my grandmother in a film than on a picture. So in this way, just an intensification because it's even more alive because it's moving. So in this way, it would just push this logic. I don't know if that's what you were alluding to, but clearly to see somebody that I love who happens to not to be here anymore, and to see not only a picture, which is always something, but moving and speaking, that makes it all the more intense. So in this way, maybe. Susan?
I was thinking because it's almost like a replication because film is a series of still images combined together in a particular way. The replication and doubling and I was thinking it was really interesting that you chose the shot of that particular film because it said the Russian filmmaker Sakharov who shot with his Russian arc in one long take. It's about 90 minutes, right? This sort of going through the Hermitage in Russia. So you have reproductions as well as the closest thing I guess you can get to a one-shot image. Okay. And I just thought it might be interesting to consider.
Yeah. Plus the fact that it's on a museum, so it's on still images that you film and so forth, like Travaux de Louvre or something. Yeah, that's a good. That's too smart for me, but that's a good.
Yves, I think we'll.
Yeah, we'll stop. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.